For founders of color, and this talk, we assume that you're ready for funding, kind of whatever that ends up meaning. Hey, buddy. So whatever that ends up meaning for you. And so I don't want to have much of a debate of like, what does it mean to be ready for funding? Just assume we are. And then two, it's not impossible to get funding. It's just statistically very unlikely, as we'll show. And we have to ask ourselves, both on the investment side and on the founder side, if we're okay with that, ethically, morally. And the rough news is that being better, I argue, won't necessarily help. And I'll explain why. For investors, how we invest our money can perpetuate things you don't like racism, without even intending to. Unless you like racism, in which case you're going to love all the numbers I'm about to show. And if you care about changing the world, then you can, via this vehicle. Reminder, Tulsa was an incredibly vibrant economic community of Black people, and it was entirely destroyed. That's just a historical note. So how startup ecosystems work. All right, so you're gonna have to bear with me as I kind of talk you through this. Let's start at the bottom left, right? So you have an idea. Let's say I want to make the world's best oat bar. And so I need to find the money to buy all the materials, maybe to get some packaging, just kind of bootstrap, figure things out, right? Typically, that'll be something like sub 100K, sometimes sub 50K of capital that I need to acquire. Maybe I need to get a website built, all these things that I don't know. Not one person knows everything, right? So you typically get that money and you get to a point and you sort of say like, hey, look, I've shown people want this oat bar. I really want to go explore this and I believe there's an opportunity to do it. And so based on just a little bit of traction and proof points, sort of somebody say like, okay, you're serious. Now let's go raise this pre-seed round is what it's called. And so in that pre-seed round, it's typically below $1 million. By the way, everything here has like a huge asterisk next to it, depending on the industry, depending on everything, right? So you go raise a little below $1 million, you can bring on a team, you can get physical space, you can start producing and get to a really good traction point. Maybe you make your first 500,000, 100,000, $1 million, right? Who knows? And so you've basically proven out at a very early level some fundamental things about your business. Now, typically at this stage, you have not figured out everything of your business still. In fact, if you got even as far as I talked about, historically, that would be a very mature pre-seed company, right? But a little bit of what I'm going to talk about is how that's changed over time. So then you go out and you raise a seed round. That seed round now, so pre-seed used to be called seed round, that sort of initial capital. But now seed means rounds anywhere typically from around 2 million to 5 or 7. It's very fluctuating, right? And so then you use all of that money to go get the traction. And by traction here, we just mean sales, customers. It can really depend on your industry. Just proof that things are working, and typically that's a revenue number. And over time, it definitely is a revenue number. And so then you get all that, and then you go raise from venture capitalists. Now, venture capitalists, for those who don't know, are individuals who go raise money themselves from a bunch of very high net worth individuals and entities. They come back and say, I'm going to go invest that money, right? So these are entities that you go to, and sort of they're the big, everybody imagines like Shark Tank, you go and you pitch these people. It's really like that. But that's when you go there. Everything before that, typically, historically, had been maybe you're talking to just a very wealthy individual, high net worth individual, it's also called. Now, increasingly, venture capitalists have operate at the seed stage now as well. So you may get that kind of boardroom meeting a little sooner than you might have used to. So, okay, right? So you get the money, that helps you get the money, that helps you get the money, that helps you get the money. Now, at the end of that, ideally, all things working out, you have what's called a liquidity event. That could be the company goes public. That could be they sell the company. And let's say I build this oat bar company called Odorific. That's the name for it now. And we sell for $500 million. Great exit. Everybody gets a great return. Well, what happens now is that all the people that were invested in me, I've just created a bunch of really rich people with that event, right? And so what happened, you see the angel on the top, that money starts to funnel down as those people become engaged in the angel, in the investment community, typically at the pre-seed stage, sometimes the bootstrapping, even seed stage. That's typically how something like this might go. So that's the typical circle of funding life. Now, some things have been happening over the past, 5 years or so. That deals tend to be getting bigger, and they are fewer, and they are later stage. So it's created this gap, right? Now, one of the attributes of this gap is that there are fewer founders of color, and certainly female founders as well. But for this purposes of this talk, we're going to talk specifically about founders of color, including women of color. There are fewer people of color founded businesses at that stage, and there are reasons for that. One of the other things is that at that level specifically, historically, venture capitalists haven't really cared significantly about the diverse racial or gender makeup of their funds. Their responsibility is to go make money for their limited partners, for their investors, right? And then you have this additional trend where angels invest in who and what they know. Okay, so yeah, circle of funding line. And I want to preface this by saying that the fundraising journey is difficult no matter who you are, and no matter what stage it is. I've never heard anybody say it is actually easy, and so I want to contextualize that. I'd say for the pre-seed round, particularly that first level, it is very hard in the beginning specifically to get some of those first checks. So that round specifically is some of the hardest money, and this is from talking to tens and tens of entrepreneurs. Hardest money you'll ever get. Okay, cool. So what's the problem here, right? If that's kind of how the way things are, what's the problem? Well, the numbers for people of color founders and women of color especially are pretty brutal. So for the problem for founders of color, less than 1% of venture goes to Black founders. I got my numbers wrong before. Latino founders now have 1.8% as of 2018 of venture capital funding. Of venture raised in the last decade, again, you're seeing well below 1% for Latinx women and Black women. There's well-documented studies about how these meetings go, that they're often framed in the negative versus when you're talking to men, it's more framed in the positive and what things could be. In 2018, Harlem Capital did a report and they identified just 105 people of color who raised over $1 million. So that's that seed stage and above, typically, right? That's like all, right? And another report showed 34 Black women ever. So if you're a Black woman trying to raise money, assuming the numbers from 2 years ago, you're trying to be number 35 ever. On the investment side, some pretty well-documented demographics. 84.6% of senior investors are male. Only 2% of VC are Black. Couldn't even find a number on Latinx VC. POC that, and even investors that are POC there are in such a dominant other environment, they kind of have to play the game, right? There's not a ton of room for bucking the system at that point. 78% of angel investors are male, 87.6% of angel investors are white. This is the American Angel Report, came out 2 years ago. 76% over 50 years old. Okay, cool. So ran through the numbers, don't love it. And so this is kind of one of the main points, that not only do people that raise that money have significant amount to hire the team they need to reach the traction points, they also have enough runway to where they can make mistakes. So much of entrepreneurship is experimentation and testing. And in order to do that, in order to make the mistakes and learn, you need to have capital to exercise. All right. So the problems. Investors have gotten a little less risky and demand more traction before their first investment. This is not necessarily their fault, right? So what's basically happened is the circle of life has been kind of cut a little bit. These liquidity events create angel investors that are now particularly interested in investing in things at the seed stage. Again, sometimes this means getting revenue of like 100,000 or so. We'll talk a little about organizations that have that kind of requirement. They require a good deal of sales, and so you just start. The line has risen, right? That sort of red bar of that ceiling, and so the money's not going there. Whereas that's where most of the founders of color exist, right? In the beginning stage, especially as societies become more warm to their involvement. Okay, so issues at the late stage, right? That's too late stage for where most of entrepreneurs of color are, though there are some there. There's familiarity bias and pattern matching. We talk about pattern matching a lot in venture capital fundraising. Then even at the seed stage, that's where we've seen a lot of movement over the past year or two, particularly over the past few months, of people trying to say like, hey, we care about investing in people of color. We have this new seed fund. We're investing $10 million in seed fund underrepresented founders. The issue with a lot of that is that founders of color aren't getting the initial funding to even be at that point in the pipeline. Now, I don't want to give credit to the idea that it is a pipeline problem, because there are still tons and tons of founders of color that have made it to that stage. But if they're not seeing the volume they want, it may be because we're not providing the resources as an ecosystem at the beginning level. And oftentimes, again, when they do raise, they're not able to raise as much as their white counterparts. And then we'll get to the pre-seed stage in a second. So what does the pre-seed conversation end up looking like? Really, it's like, hi, this is my startup. Oh, terrific. An angel investor or an accelerator or somebody says, you're too early for me. I want to see more traction. And you say, okay, totally cool. Sounds like I'll need some money for team or growth, right? Where should I seek capital? And they're just like, I don't know. Have you met these people? And then you have that same conversation, right? And so this is not simply my experience, is the experience of many founders of color that I know. The sources at the pre-seed level favor those with existing networks and resources. This is where it gets very messy as a presentation. Thank you for your patience here. There's a bunch of different sources that it comes from. Personal financing, you have a decent job that gives you access to money, friends and family, angels and networking, we'll talk about that in a second. There's crowdfunding, happy to talk about that. Pre-seed funds, and they swear they exist, but there's very few true pre-seed funds that we'll talk about. There are accelerators, that's often a common path. Then you have this sort of bucket of grants, pitch competitions, bank loans, credit cards. And so what are the challenges there, right? So as far as personal financing, without even getting into the entire world of diversity, equity, inclusion, and diversity in tech, there's a lower probability of having that excess income and having that safety net to be able to expend that excess income, right? And then oftentimes, if you're working while you are working on your startup, if you have a full-time job, let's just say you're not serious, you need to be full-time with the company, right? So the friends and family, low probability of high net worth network. I legitimately could not ask my grandma for $25 without it hurting her, Then angels and networking. Like I mentioned, the traction expectations have risen. They can be often long sales cycles for a 5K or 10K check when you're trying to raise a big round. And implicit bias applies to them as well. Sometimes even more so because it's a one-to-one relationship. Issues with crowdfunding we can get to again. Pre-seed funds rarely actually exist. They're still relationship based, and oftentimes those pre-seed funds can't even raise money themselves. We can talk a little bit about the people who are trying to do good work but are having difficulty raising their funds. So accelerators, aside from being very selective, which is true whether or not you're a person of color or not, they're still susceptible to bias, historically bad at diversity, and most these days want to see seed level traction. And that's the same thing with crowdfunding sites. Like Republic started out for anybody to be able to raise, and now increasingly now they won't you take a campaign under $1 million. And even those need seed capital for you to seed your campaign. Sometimes a minimum 20K for WeFunder, higher for other ones as well. That's because WeFunder is the most accessible one. So grants competitions can be cool, but you're not going to get to $1 million that way. And bank loans for people of color are not historically great, and not the best long-term strategy. And credit cards, I kind of didn't want to go into. Okay, cool. Well, it sounds like I'm making a bunch of excuses, right? Like these are all still valid paths, but you can see that there are meaningful barriers, and often, many times specifically for people of color who do not have access to that network and capital. So what happens? Well, again, this is more illustrative than scientific. You go through the journey, you get some good signals, you have difficulty creating a moment, and that, again, it's difficult for anybody. Maybe you join an accelerator, maybe you get another accelerator, maybe they don't offer money, maybe they do. But you're facing all of these barriers and you're not able to get the amount that you need to really demonstrate the traction to be interesting. So over time of just fizzling, you end up becoming what investors call uninvestable. You've been working on this for years. Why haven't you made progress like your peers? Okay, so the world-changing companies that could have been aren't. That's because they couldn't raise that initial pre-seed capital to get to the level of seed that now we have so much attention on. So one potential solution. Well, so one, again, if you like an equity, this is all great. Things are going wonderfully for you. And you should have some good footage. Lovely scotch. But for founders, really, in the current environment, it sounds awful, but it's do your best. I've offered a fundraising process here, which is fairly standard. We can talk about tools in the question Q&A if you want. Research and organize, reach out and manage the funnel, follow up and send updates, keep growing as best you can, keep trying to fundraise and also growing the business, and doing your best to over time close by building those relationships. That's really all you can do, is run the process, and just try and run it really, really well, which isn't the most insightful advice. So should we just be better founders, right? We talk about this. So I'm part of a Divinc alumni group, and the founders and I talk about this all the time. It's like, oh man, we just got to get better numbers. Oh, we just have to have a better financial model. We just have to go and you have to pitch better. It's something about this it's slide 8 in our deck. And it just became increasingly clear that when we talk to other founders, they're like, hey, that founder got 150K invested from this high net worth individual. Why was that? And then we talked to somebody who knew the situation. They were like, oh, I just liked him. Right. And so we're fed this idea that we're fed as people of color our entire lives, that if we're just better, if we just work harder, it's going to work differently for us. Not to mention the people that we need to network with. Oftentimes we have no connection with. We were trying to network and gain the favor of somebody who drives in, flies in private planes and plays a lot of golf. And I'm just like into indie hipster stuff. Right. And so it can be difficult to even on that social level. And I think that's something people don't talk about. The token successes, right? Well, hey, look, this founder, person of color, did great, right? They raised the money. We love this founder, right? And so what this does is this tries to negate the experience of the overwhelming majority for the experience of one individual. So I just ask you not to make that fallacy, because it's a very easy fallacy to dismiss. And so I would just stop making that one. So angels are not the cause of the problem, right? But they can be part of the solution. And angels are working. God bless them with their limited resources to be able to reinvest their capital into these scenes and keep the startup ecosystem and engine going. Really, they're amazing people, and oftentimes, depending on where you are, they don't have as much capital, right? The San Francisco Bay Area. Sometimes there can be dumb money over there in New York, dumb money over there. Oftentimes in Austin, they're trying to decide between an angel investment in you and a vacation for their family, right? So I don't blame Austin angels. I don't think they're bad people at all. And especially the ones who write the first checks, right? These people are some of the best people in their class. Especially when you consider that pre-seed funding is irrational. For as much as everything I'm arguing, it's just ridiculous to invest. It is the riskiest stage to invest, right? But without it, the ecosystem can't exist. And without it, we're not going to see change in the economic empowerment of people of color. I do think angels can think differently. I think that they can open up the ideas of what they think, the traction levels they think they need to be successful, right? A lot of investors think it's just a matter of numbers, right? And I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think this early, traditionally and very much in other scenes, you're investing on team, you're investing on vision, you're investing on market. They need to have a lot of those other things together, but if you're investing on current numbers at the early stage, you are just not a pre-seed investor. So I just wanted to make a note that the pattern matching logic necessarily counts out people of color and stifles innovation. Again, if we worked on the historical data, which is historically incredibly inequitable data, it would say, don't invest in these people. We don't have enough data to support it. We haven't seen enough successes. So we can't rely on that as a decision-making index. So again, my solution is just like a minute or two more here. A pre-seed people of color focused angel group. And there are a couple of efforts in Austin to put together angel networks. Not necessarily, not explicitly toward the pre-seed stage. My argument is that these need to have the impact that they want to have to be at the earlier stage. Now that's asking a lot of people and telling them what to do with their money. And I'm not interested in doing that. We'll talk about that in a second. But what does that get us? That gets us this ecosystem now that can raise the traction level of these early companies, can bring in new innovative ideas at a time when so many things just seem like copycats, right? Serve markets that haven't been served, the economic opportunity. And for me, that's not the primary, but for other people, that economic opportunity is tremendous, right? And more people are starting to see this, for women, for people of color, for queer folks. So you should angel invest. There's a little description here about what it takes to be an angel investor. High level rules: only invest what you're willing to, I should say, lose. Typically you make about 5 to 6 bets a year. My recommendation would be make about 2 of them pre-seed, invest in the right way, learn on team, people, markets, vision, and strategy. And realize that all of this is a gamble. And still overwhelmingly, the percentage of success stories that come out of very intelligent, very rigorous, very data-driven investing processes, still so few successes. And so whenever we bet on a founder, we're betting our values, and we're betting the world we want to see. And so the thought is that you should bet early on founders of color. We have more to learn and more to gain there. So getting those founders their first 50 to 100K can take them to traction levels that takes them to the next step, to the next step, to the next step. And you get to, it's your money. You get to decide at that pre-seed level what is comfortable for you. You don't need to give a 10K check to everybody who comes up and says, I have an idea for a new kind of X, right? But opening our ideas about what is fund worthy and who is fund worthy, and really challenging our own ideas about that, can create a more vigorous, robust ecosystem.